Great. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to talk about kind of how gas is exchanged inside the lungs when we breathe. So we've already talked about kind of the internal structure of the respiratory system. We know the air comes into the nasal cavity, it passes through the pharynx, goes down through the larynx, then the trachea, where it gets to our primary bronchi, which lead to each lung, our right and left lung. After it passes through the bronchi, it goes into the lungs, into the bronchioles, where they divides up into smaller and smaller tubes until finally we're at the level of the smallest little tubes. These are our terminal bronchiole. And these terminal bronchiole will dead end into these little sacs of air. These little sacs of air, they're called alveoli in plural. A singular little sac is called an alveolus. Okay, so we have this singular little sac, and the walls of this sac are made up of simple squamous epithelium. And if you remember, these are just tiny little flat, puny cells that are very thin, and they provide just a perfect thin surface for things to diffuse across. If we think back to diffusion, diffusion works really great across very small distances. So in this case, this simple squamous epithelium is just a thin little layer that allows diffusion or things to diffuse across very quickly because it is thin. All right. So next to this alveoli, or this alveolus, we're going to have a capillary, and this capillary is going to kind of come next to that alveolus, and it's going to be carrying blood in this direction. All right. And this blood that comes into this capillary, this is blood that is returning from the body after it's already circulated through all of our tissues. And so it's going to be very low in oxygen. All right. So if I were to draw these little blue dots, these blue dots represent the amount of oxygen that's in this blood. All right. So blue is oxygen. And this blood that's returning from the body is going to be low in oxygen because that oxygen has been used up by our tissues. Okay. In contrast, the air that we breathe in is going to be really high in oxygen. So we're going to have all of this oxygen in the air that we breathe in that goes towards our alveoli. Okay. In fact, the atmospheric air itself contains about 21% oxygen. So the air that we breathe in contains quite a lot of oxygen. On the flip side, this air that we breathe in is going to contain not much carbon dioxide at all. That's because the atmospheric air only contains is only 0.03% carbon dioxide. So if I were to do carbon dioxide, I'll draw carbon dioxide in pink. There's going to be just a little bit of carbon dioxide in the air that enters into our lungs. The blood that returns from the body to the lungs, that's going to contain a whole lot of carbon dioxide because our cells produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of cellular respiration. So this is CO2. So all this carbon dioxide is inside the blood returning to the lungs. All right. Now, if we think about it, a really nice automatic thing is going to happen when we get down to the alveoli. Here, inside the alveolus, we've got a whole bunch of oxygen because the air contains a lot of oxygen. And on one side, on the inside of the alveoli, it has a lot of oxygen. On the side of the blood vessel, there's not much oxygen at all. So this oxygen is going to want to automatically diffuse from the alveolus to the capillary. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So all this oxygen diffuses into the capillary. And on the flip side, we've got all this CO2 in the blood. It's going to want to diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. So this guy is going to diffuse this way. All this CO2 diffuses into the alveolus. And what we're left with is blood that's rich in oxygen, low in CO2, that's going to then travel to the tissues. All right? And this is from the tissues. And the important part here is that all this happens automatically, and that's perfect. We don't have to spend any energy to pump oxygen from the lungs to the blood. It happens automatically through diffusion, and it happens really quickly. Okay? Now, when we're talking about this, it's important to bring up this idea of pressure. Now, pressure, you just think of it as pressure is kind of like the weight of a gas. You know, if you have we have a bunch of gases in this room, and all of those gases are bouncing off all the objects in this room. The magnitude of the force that that gas exerts on the objects in the room, and us included, as it bounces off these things, that's pressure. If you have more gas crammed in the room, you've got more gas bouncing off stuff, more force, pressure goes up. All right? Fewer gases, pressure goes down. Well, it turns out that the pressure of all the gases in the atmosphere is around 760 millimeters of mercury. That's kind of the force that all the pressures in the atmosphere exert together. If we wanted to figure out what kind of an individual gas, how much it contributes to that overall pressure, it's a pretty simple calculation. What you do is oxygen, for example, oxygen's 21% of the atmospheric air. So if we wanted to figure out the contribution of oxygen alone, we just say 0.21, which is 21%, times the total pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. That's going to equal about 160 millimeters of mercury. That is called a partial pressure of oxygen, PO2. Partial pressure of oxygen. That's the oxygen's contribution to the total atmospheric pressure. Okay? Well, if we think about it, the partial pressure, so gases, they really only care about the partial pressure of the gases. You know, in other words, oxygen only cares about its own partial pressure. It doesn't care about the partial pressure of nitrogen. It only cares about the partial pressure of itself. And it's going to move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, right? That's what kind of drives the direction of diffusion. So here, this air that we breathe in, the partial pressure of oxygen here is 160. The partial pressure of oxygen here in the blood returning from the tissues is much lower. It's around 40. Okay? With that being said, what's going to be the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood after the exchange of these gases occurs? It's not going to be 160. It's actually going to be around 100 millimeters of mercury. And that's because these two areas are going to undergo diffusion until they're in equilibrium. Okay? So if you think about it, halfway between 160 and 40 is 100. Okay? They're going to meet in the middle. Once they're in equilibrium, we can't suck more oxygen out of the air itself. That's why the partial pressure of oxygen can never get up to 160 in the capillaries. It only comes to equilibrium. So we take this 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen that circulates to the tissues. All that oxygen diffuses to the tissues, and by the time we get back to the lungs, we're back down to 40.